It was supposed to be a peaceful Saturday afternoon. The sun was shining, a gentle breeze rustled the trees, and my son, Oliver, was outside, lost in his own world. At 14 years old, Oliver found comfort in the small, familiar things, his long hair being one of them. It was his source of security, a coping mechanism in a world that often overwhelmed him due to his autism. Then, like a storm breaking through the calm, Karen struck. Karen was a force of terror in our neighborhood, the self-appointed queen of the HOA. She had tormented families before, but this time, she took it to a horrifying new level. Without a word of warning, she stormed into our yard, a pair of scissors clutched tightly in her hand. Her eyes were filled with rage, disgust evident in the way she looked at my son's flowing hair. In her twisted mind, a boy having long hair was an abomination, something she had to correct. Before I could react, she lunged. In broad daylight, in front of witnesses, she grabbed Oliver by the hair and started hacking at it with the scissors. Oliver's scream ripped through the air, a sound of pure terror and anguish. He thrashed, trying to pull away, but Karen held him firm. Chunk after chunk of his beloved hair fell to the ground. He sobbed, pleading for her to stop, but she didn't care. To her, she was doing the neighborhood a favor. I bolted out of the house, my wife right behind me. But by the time we reached Oliver, the damage had already been done. Karen stepped back, satisfied, as my son collapsed to his knees, clutching the severed strands of his own hair, rocking back and forth in shock. Oliver's long hair wasn't just hair, it was his comfort, his shield against a world that often felt too loud, too chaotic. As an autistic child, Oliver struggled with sensory overload. The world could be too bright, too noisy, too unpredictable. But amidst all that uncertainty, his hair had always been a constant. Whenever he felt overwhelmed, he would run his fingers through it, grounding himself. It was his way of finding peace. We had seen it time and time again, especially during thunderstorms. The booming thunder, the flashing lightning, each one sent him into a state of sheer panic. But then, in the middle of the chaos, he would reach for his hair. He would weave his fingers through the strands, slow and deliberate, and little by little, the panic would subside. His breathing would steady, his trembling would ease. It was a ritual, one that helped him navigate a world that often felt too much to bear. And now, Karen had ripped that away from him. As my wife and I knelt beside Oliver, his sobs shaking his small frame, I realized the true extent of the trauma she had inflicted. It wasn't just about the hair, it was about taking away something that made him feel safe. Karen had violated him in a way that cut deeper than any physical wound. And the worst part? The people who had witnessed it did nothing to stop her. As I cradled my son, my gaze darted around the neighborhood. People stood on their porches, on their lawns, watching the aftermath unfold. They had seen everything. They had watched as a grown woman assaulted a child. Yet not one of them had stepped in. Fear. I could see it in their eyes. Fear of Karen. Fear of what she might do to them if they intervened. She had ruled this neighborhood for years, making life hell for anyone who dared to defy her. She had driven families out, levied outrageous HOA fines, and humiliated those she deemed unworthy. Everyone knew better than to cross her. But this was different. This was a child. My child. And they had stood by and let it happen. I stood up, my hands clenched into fists. You all just stood there, I demanded, my voice shaking with rage. You let this happen. To a child. To my son. No one spoke. No one met my eyes. I could feel my blood boiling. I had dedicated my life to protecting others. As a former chief of police, I had upheld justice, ensured the safety of those in my community. And yet, in my own neighborhood, in front of my own home, I had failed to protect my son. But I wouldn't fail him now. Karen didn't even try to deny what she had done. In fact, she looked proud of herself. Honestly, you should be thanking me, she said, crossing her arms. That boy looked ridiculous. Boys shouldn't have long hair. It's unnatural. I was doing you all a favor. A favor. She thought she was doing us a favor. My hands clenched at my sides, my jaw tightening. I wanted to scream at her, to unleash the full force of my rage. But I knew that wouldn't be enough. Yelling wouldn't fix what she had done. No, I needed something more. You think you can get away with this? I asked, my voice low and deadly calm. You think you can just assault my son and walk away? Karen smirked. You can complain to the HOA all you want. You know how that goes. And that was the problem. The HOA wouldn't do anything. They never did. Because Karen was one of them. But this time, she had gone too far. And I was going to make sure she paid for it. Karen had always been more than just an annoying neighbor. She was the self-appointed ruler of our HOA, a tyrant who wielded power over the community with an iron fist. For years, she had dictated who was welcome and who wasn't. She had imposed ridiculous rules, levied absurd fines, and driven families out with her relentless harassment. She had destroyed lives before. And the worst part? The HOA had let her. Every complaint against her was dismissed. Every act of cruelty was ignored. She had the board in her pocket, ensuring that no matter what she did, she would never face consequences. She had created an empire of fear. But fear only lasts as long as people let it. I could feel something shifting. As I looked at my neighbors, at the shame on their faces, I saw cracks forming in the foundation of Karen's power. People were starting to realize just how much they had let her get away with. And this time, it wasn't just a petty fine or a nasty letter, it was an attack on a child. Karen had overplayed her hand. And I was going to make sure it cost her everything. Karen had ruled through fear for years, and the HOA had enabled her, brushing aside complaints and allowing her unchecked power. But this time was different. This wasn't an unfair fine or a passive-aggressive HOA letter. This was an outright attack, on a child, no less. As the shock of what happened to Oliver rippled through the community, I noticed something shift. The people who had stood by silently, too afraid to speak out, started whispering amongst themselves. There was a heaviness in the air, a collective realization that they had been complicit in Karen's reign of terror. It started small, a few neighbors approaching my wife and me to express their outrage and support. But soon, it spread like wildfire. People who had been too afraid to act before were now emboldened by Karen's unforgivable actions. She went too far this time, one neighbor muttered. We should have stopped her, another admitted. The cracks in Karen's power were beginning to widen, and for the first time, she looked unsettled. Karen had gotten away with her bullying for years because people were too scared to challenge her. But she had never faced someone like me before. As a former chief of police, I knew the law. I knew how to gather evidence, how to make a case that couldn't be ignored. I started by documenting everything: witness statements, security footage, photos of Oliver's butchered hair, and his emotional distress. I contacted a lawyer specializing in civil cases, and together, we built a case for assault, harassment, and emotional distress. The next step was filing a police report. Unlike the HOA, the police weren't under Karen's thumb. The moment I mentioned child endangerment and physical assault, they took it seriously. Officers arrived at our home, took Oliver's statement with the care and sensitivity he needed, and then went straight to Karen's house. The sight of Karen being confronted by law enforcement was satisfying. She sputtered excuses, but for the first time, her words held no weight. The law didn't care about her HOA status or her husband's wealth. She was finally facing real consequences. Karen had always wielded power because the HOA let her. It was time to dismantle that system, brick by brick. Using my law enforcement background, I started digging into HOA records, speaking to past victims, and uncovering a pattern of corruption. Unjust fines, fraudulent financial practices, and even illegal property seizures, all orchestrated by Karen and her inner circle. I compiled everything into a formal complaint, sending copies to the state HOA regulatory board, local media outlets, and community leaders. Then, I called for an emergency HOA meeting. With the weight of evidence behind me and the newfound courage of my neighbors, we confronted the HOA board. One by one, people stood up to share their experiences, their anger, their demand for justice. The board members, realizing Karen was now a liability, had no choice but to act. Karen was stripped of her position. An independent investigation was launched into her financial dealings. And the board, for the first time in years, faced real accountability. The fallout from Karen's actions was swift and brutal. With legal charges pending and her hold over the HOA shattered, Karen found herself isolated. The very people who had once feared her turned their backs on her. Her husband, unwilling to be dragged down with her, distanced himself, letting her take the full brunt of the consequences alone. The final blow came when the media picked up the story. What had started as a local scandal gained traction online, painting Karen as the epitome of an abusive HOA tyrant. The court of public opinion was ruthless, and with the community rallying against her, she had nowhere left to run. Soon after, Karen and her husband put their house up for sale. Their reign in our neighborhood was over. While Karen's downfall was a victory, the true battle was helping Oliver heal. The trauma of that day lingered, but our family was determined to restore his sense of security. We gave Oliver the power to decide what he wanted. He chose to grow his hair back, and we supported him every step of the way. Our family, friends, and community came together, showing him love and reminding him that he was perfect just the way he was. More importantly, we worked to ensure something like this could never happen again. The HOA was restructured, new protections were put in place, and we transformed the neighborhood from a place of fear into a place of support and community. Oliver found his peace again, and in the process, we all learned an important lesson. No bully, no matter how powerful, can stand against the united strength of people who refuse to be silenced. As the weight of public outrage bore down on her, Karen attempted to salvage what little reputation she had left. She issued a public statement, claiming she had merely acted out of concern for the neighborhood's appearance and had not intended to harm Oliver. Her words, however, rang hollow. The community knew better. They had witnessed her cruelty for years. Oliver's pain, his tears, the way he clutched his severed hair, those were things no apology could erase. People saw through her attempts at damage control, and instead of sympathy, her statement was met with further condemnation. Karen even tried to reach out to my family. She sent a letter to our home, filled with flowery words about misunderstandings and wanting to make amends. But we knew the truth. If Karen had truly been sorry, she never would have done what she did in the first place. Her apology was nothing more than an act of self-preservation, a desperate attempt to mitigate the damage she had inflicted upon herself. Her attempts to reclaim her standing in the community failed. The damage was irreversible. The people she had once controlled with fear now ignored her entirely. The queen of the HOA had fallen, and there was no saving her now. Karen may have lost her influence, but legally, she was still on the hook for what she had done. My lawyer had prepared a solid case, and we were determined to see it through. The charges included assault, harassment, and emotional distress. We had the evidence, security footage, witness statements, and expert testimony from a psychologist who had assessed Oliver's trauma. Karen, predictably, tried to delay the proceedings. Her husband, still wealthy and well-connected, hired top-tier lawyers to argue that she had merely been exercising her rights as a concerned neighbor. They tried to twist the narrative, painting Oliver's long hair as an unacceptable distraction that had prompted Karen to act impulsively. But their tactics failed. The court saw the truth for what it was. Karen wasn't a concerned neighbor. She was a bully who had attacked a vulnerable child. Oliver's testimony, given through a recorded session with a child psychologist, was heartbreaking. The judge watched as my son described his fear, his confusion, and how his sense of safety had been stolen from him in an instant. His pain was undeniable, and no amount of legal maneuvering could change that. After weeks of legal battles, the verdict finally came. The court found Karen guilty on multiple counts: child endangerment, assault, and harassment. She was sentenced to community service, fined heavily, and ordered to attend mandatory anger management courses. But the real punishment wasn't just legal, it was social. Her name was permanently tainted. She could no longer stroll through the neighborhood with an air of superiority. The power she had once wielded so effortlessly was gone. Parents shielded their children from her, people refused to make eye contact, and invitations to high society events disappeared. Even her husband, who had stood by her for years, seemed to lose patience. Rumors spread that he was considering divorce, unwilling to let Karen's reputation drag him down. It was poetic justice. Karen had spent years tearing others down, and now she had finally destroyed herself. With Karen gone, the neighborhood felt different. Lighter. Freer. The new HOA board was filled with people who actually cared about the community, not just their own power. Policies were rewritten, ensuring that no single individual could ever hold the kind of unchecked control Karen had. People started talking to one another again, forming real friendships instead of just tolerating each other out of fear. Block parties were organized, and neighbors who had once lived in isolation now came together to celebrate their victory. Most importantly, Oliver felt safe again. We made sure he knew he was supported, that what had happened wasn't his fault. He continued to grow his hair, and not once did anyone in the neighborhood make another comment about it. Instead, they complimented him, telling him how great he looked, how strong he was for standing up to a bully. Karen's removal wasn't just about getting justice for Oliver, it was about reclaiming our home from fear. And we had done it. Months after everything had settled, as I sat on my porch watching Oliver play in the yard, I reflected on everything we had been through. Karen had thought she could get away with it, just as she always had. She had assumed that we, like so many before us, would be too afraid to fight back. But she was wrong. People like Karen thrive on silence, on intimidation, on making others feel powerless. The moment you stand up to them, the moment you make it clear that you will not be bullied, their power crumbles. To Karen, I had only one thing to say. You messed with the wrong family, and you paid the price. Karen's departure left a void in the neighborhood, but it was a void that was quickly filled with something better: unity. With her oppressive rule gone, people found the courage to reconnect, to rebuild what she had worked so hard to destroy. The HOA, now under new leadership, made sweeping changes to ensure that no one could ever abuse their power the way Karen had. Transparency became a priority. Meetings were open to all residents, decisions were voted on fairly, and complaints were addressed with genuine concern rather than dismissed based on personal biases. Oliver, though still healing, was beginning to feel comfortable again. His hair had started to grow back, and with it, so had his confidence. My wife and I made sure he knew that what had happened was not his fault and that he had every right to be himself without fear. The support from our neighbors only reinforced that truth. They rallied around him, showing him that he was valued, accepted, and safe. Karen, meanwhile, had all but disappeared. Stripped of her power and influence, she became a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when arrogance and cruelty go unchecked. Those who had once feared her influence now pitied her, though few cared enough to ask what had become of her. As months passed, our neighborhood began to transform in ways I had never imagined possible. Families who had once stayed locked behind their doors started to come outside more. Parents felt safe letting their children play in the streets without the looming threat of Karen's disapproving gaze. We celebrated this newfound sense of freedom by organizing a community event, a block party unlike anything we had seen before. It was a gathering of people, not just as neighbors, but as friends. Music filled the air, children laughed, and for the first time in years, there was genuine joy in our streets. Oliver had a special place at the event. Many of our neighbors made a point to acknowledge him, letting him know how proud they were of his strength. Some even gifted him small tokens of appreciation, things like hair accessories, headbands, and handmade bracelets, symbolic gestures to remind him that he was accepted just the way he was. It was a moment of healing not just for Oliver, but for our entire family. We had fought for him, and in doing so, we had helped change the very fabric of our community. Just when we thought the nightmare was over, Karen made one last desperate attempt to reclaim her place in the neighborhood. She showed up one afternoon, standing at the entrance of the community, watching from a distance. At first, people ignored her, but as whispers spread, a sense of unease settled over the block. It was clear she wanted to gauge whether she still had any influence, whether she could manipulate her way back in. But the community had changed. No one feared her anymore. Instead of welcoming her back, residents turned their backs on her. Conversations continued as if she wasn't there, children played freely without looking in her direction, and no one acknowledged her presence. Karen had become invisible in the very place she had once ruled. Defeated, she left. We never saw her again. Through all of this, I learned one of the most valuable lessons of my life. Strength isn't just about standing up for yourself, it's about standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. Karen had spent years terrorizing our neighborhood because she thrived on division, on making people feel small and powerless. But when we came together, when we refused to be intimidated, her power crumbled. Oliver taught me that real courage isn't about fighting, it's about staying true to yourself no matter what. Even after everything he had endured, he never once questioned who he was. He continued to let his hair grow, continued to find comfort in it, because he refused to let someone else dictate his identity. That was the greatest victory of all. Life continued, but it was different now. Better. Our neighborhood was no longer defined by fear, but by unity. The battle we had fought wasn't just for Oliver. It was for every person who had ever been made to feel less than because they were different. As I sat on my porch, watching my son laugh and play in the yard, his long hair flowing freely in the breeze, I knew one thing for certain. Karen had lost. But we had won something much greater: our peace, our community, and most importantly, our freedom to be ourselves.